Shalom, this is Yair Davidiy speaking to you from the land of Israel. Today we are about to discuss the Hebrew kings of Norway. Norway is an important country, it is an interesting country. We understand that Norway represents the tribe of Naphtali, or predominantly the Israelite tribe of Naphtali, though there are other tribes, descendants of other Israelite tribes also amongst the Norwegians, including the tribe of Asher, which historically was important. But at present, the predominant Israelite nation in Norway is that of Naphtali. Naphtali was the son of Bilhah. Naphtali was the brother of Dan, and both of them were the sons of Bilhah. Bilhah was the maidservant of Rachel, the main wife of Jacob. Jacob was also known as Israel. Originally had 12 tribes of Israel. But they had different mothers. The two main wives were Rachel and Leah. The maidservants of Leah were Zilpah, and the maidservant of Leah was Zilpah. The maidservant of Rachel was Bilhah. From Bilhah, Jacob begat Dan and Naphtali. Dan gave rise to the people of Denmark, Naphtali to those of Norway. And they are part of the lost 10 tribes. The lost 10 tribes, the Israelite tribes, were together in one unit in the land of Israel. They were conquered by the Assyrians, taken into exile. That is the northern section. The 10 tribes were taken into exile. 10 out of the 12 tribes were taken into exile. Were taken into different areas of the Assyrian Empire. And they lost consciousness of their ancestry, but physically they remained together, and they migrated. We can trace their migrations, so we trace them to areas in the west and in the north to the land of Israel, where it was prophesied that they would go to. The prophecy said that's where the lost 10 tribes would go to. The lost 10 tribes were to be in the north. Let's see Jeremiah 3:18 to 31:6 to 10. They were to be the northwest of the land of Israel. See Isaiah 49:12. And to the west of the land of Israel, see Isaiah 24:14, Isaiah 1:10. Also to be at the ends of the earth, that is the geographical extremities of the continental land masses, see Isaiah 24:16, 26:15, 41:8 to 9, 43:6, 49:6. Also to be in peninsulas, Jeremiah 31:18, archipelagos, groups of islands in the westerly islands of the sea, see Isaiah 24:15, 49:6. 69, Jeremiah 31:9 to 10, and numerous other verses and blessings and predictions concerning the whereabouts of the lost 10 tribes all lead us to focus on these regions, including that of Scandinavia. That is where the lost 10 tribes are to be found. And it includes, as we said, includes Scandinavia, that is Norway and its neighbours. The neighbours of Norway are Denmark to the south, Sweden to the east, and also after that Finland. They are the lands of Scandinavia. And the Norwegians are next of kin to peoples in these areas. What applies to one applies to the other. Norway benefits from the blessings that the Israelites were promised, great material blessings, great material natural resources, great material advantages, and Norway does have this. Does benefit from this. It fulfills these blessings to the 10 tribes in general, and Norway is part of them. And the blessings included being ruled by kings. It was prophesied that the chosen peoples would split into two different sections. One section would comprise 2 tribes, that is the tribes of Judah and Benjamin in the nation of Judah. And they were the ancestors of the present-day Jewish people. They remained together. They remained recognizable as the descendants of Israel, whereas the 10 tribes, were destined to separate and to lose awareness of their ancestry, but nevertheless to remain coherent entities. And amongst these entities, some of them, not all of them, but some of them would have kings ruling over them. That is, hereditary rulers, kings ruling over them, ruling parallel one to another. Genesis 17 verse 6 it says, I will make you very fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. And again in Genesis 17, I will bless her, that is bless Sarah, the wife of Abraham, the forefather of the Israelite nation, and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her that she shall be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. And these expressions, kings in 17:6 and kings of peoples in 17:16, according to the translation of the traditional understanding based on Onkelos in Aramaic, it says the kings that rule over other peoples. In other words, these nations, from these peoples would come kings of different nations ruling parallel one to each other. And this is what we find. We find this in Scandinavia where they have kings. Sweden has a king, Denmark has a king, Norway has a king. It says in Genesis 35:11, it says, and God said to him, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will be from among your descendants. We saw the explanation of the terminology used here, that is referring to two separate entities, one of two tribes that become the ancestor of the Jewish people, and another of 10 nations. The word used for nations, it says a nation and a community of nations. The word used for a community of nations implies 10 in the Hebrew, as we have shown. And this was pointed out by the Nazi, Rabbi Naphtali, Zvi Yehuda, Berlin, 1816-1893. And they were saying that the two different entities would emerge from Jacob, would emerge from Israel. One would be the Jewish people, and the other would be the 10 tribes of Israel. Only the Western nations fit this bill. It was said that amongst these those 10 tribes of Israel, some of them would have kings ruling over them parallel to each other. And this is what we find, and only amongst Western peoples do we find this. So this in itself is a proof that these nations descend from those tribes of Israel, and we have numerous other proofs. It's not the only proof we have, it supplements the other evidence that we have. The evidence includes biblical prophecy, strong biblical prophecy. It includes rabbinical commentary on these prophecies. It also includes history, linguistics, mythology, national consciousness, national traditions, and numerous other fields of evidence, and they all come together and all show us that the lost 10 tribes are in these areas. And so amongst these tribes who were exiled, there was the tribe of Naphtali. We can trace the tribe of Naphtali. We find people called Naphtalites, southeast of the Caspian Sea. In the book of Tobias mentions it as not a biblical book, but an early book found in versions of the Greek New Testament. It mentions the tribe of people from Naphtali being there in the book of Tobias. Also, we have other reports of people from Naphtali being in that region. And from that region, there were elements who migrated to Scandinavia. And in the 500s and 600s, Scandinavia received an influx of settlers who were Israelites who were from Naphtali. There was already Israelites there. This was a new input of people known as Naphtalites. That was the actual name, Naphthalite Huns, came and settled in Scandinavia, and they caused many of the former inhabitants of Scandinavia and of Norway on the coastal areas to move out. This began the Viking invasions of the West. The tribe of Asher, the Israelite tribe of Asher, was prominent amongst these Viking settlers, as well as Norwegians from Naphtali, and the new invaders also included Danes and Jutes, who also participated with the Angles and Saxons in invading England. They settled in England, and formerly they had come from Yedda in Central Asia, and they were Naphtalites from the same regions. The Vikings themselves were named after the cove peoples dwelling in inlets. And this had been described, this is how the tribe of Asher had been described. Judges 5, it says, Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan, and Dan, why did he sojourn in ships? Asher settled on the coast and dwelt in these coves, in the vicks and the inlets, and from Asher came many of the Vikings, especially those who settled in Ireland. The Vikings also settled in England and parts of England and other areas, and also in Normandy, in western France, where they helped give rise to the Norman peoples who also invaded England. We identify Ireland primarily as pertaining to the tribe of Asher, whereas Norway pertains to the tribe of Naphtali, but there were stages in the history when the history of the two nations was intermixed with each other. The two groups intermixed with each other to some degree. The Norwegians or Norse Vikings, people from Norway, they founded communities in the Faroe Islands of Scotland and Shetland, Orkney in Scotland, in Iceland, in Ireland, in Scotland, Northern England. They also founded cities in Ireland, Cork, Dublin, Limerick. And they occupied various portions of northern England. Later, many people from Norway migrated to the Netherlands, to Holland, especially to Amsterdam, where they adopted the Dutch language and Dutch names. So it's difficult to trace their ancestry, but physically they were there. So maybe 10% of the population of Norway migrated in this period, in these early times. The Norwegian population is similar to as a different DNA, somewhat from most peoples in the West. A group, the more haplogroup I1, and also they have R1A, and which is more, R1A is more connected to India or Eastern Europe, Russia. Haplogroup I1 is unique, but it's linked to the J of the Arabs and of the Jews. And these haplogroups, this DNA is significant. It can tell us about the movements of these peoples. And in the short run, it can also tell us the ancestry of the people in question. But it changes. In other words, our understanding is that, as we said before, as I said a few times, our understanding is that a group of peoples, even animals, have a group of living creatures in certain areas suddenly undergo changes. And these changes affect everything in that region. And they affect the DNA of the people in that region. It doesn't go father to son, mother to sister, mother to daughter. It goes brother to brother and neighbor to neighbor. It doesn't affect everyone in the region. It affects a good portion of the people, of the subjects, the subject matter in that region. And once the effect takes place, it is then transmitted through heredity. We find this in the animal kingdom, and we also understand that this also happens with human beings. So it's worth keeping in mind that DNA can tell us a lot in the short run concerning ancestry and kinship, but it is limited. We also find many people descendants of Scandinavians in the USA, in Michigan, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana. Sometimes up to 10 to 20% of the population. There are more than 4.5 million people of Norwegians descent in the USA, mostly in the upper Midwest and on the west coast of the USA. 55% of Norwegian Americans live in the Midwest, 21% in California, Oregon, and Washington. So they have a lot. Between 1825 and 1925, more than 800,000 Norwegians have migrated to North America. That was about 1/3 of Norway's population. The majority migrated to the USA, and the lesser numbers to Canada. And a good portion of the Norwegians, in other words, people from Norway, are to be found in the USA. The descendants of a good portion of the original inhabitants of Norway are now to be found in the USA, so this is important in specific areas. More cowboy country in the west and the northwest and so on. Now, we are interested in the kings of Norway, because this is a biblical sign, this is a biblical indication that these peoples are descended from Israelites. The first king of Norway is believed to have been Harald I, fair hair, reigned 872-930. And before then, Norway had been divided into different provinces. As far as we know, the kingship was hereditary almost from the beginning, but it stayed within the family, like it could be when the king died, it could be the uncle, it could be the father, it could be the son, it could be a cousin. But very quickly, the principle of primogeniture, going according to the firstborn son, was accepted. Olaf II, that is also known as Saint Olaf, he was an important king. He died from 1015 to he reigned from 1015 to 1028. He converted the kingdom to Christianity. Olaf II. Olaf II is considered the Rex. The Rex is considered the Rex Perpetuus Norvegii. That is the eternal king of Norway. He is the real king of Norway. He is the king of Norway. And he allows others to rule in his name from beyond the grave. They are his vassals. They are his subjects from beyond the grave. He was the once an eternal king of Norway, similar to have the figure of King David in biblical and rabbinical tradition. King David is the only true king of Israel, and other kings are extensions of his, ruling on his behalf, as if to say. So we had King Olaf II. In the 1100s and 1200s, Norway was quite powerful. It ruled over provinces in Sweden. It ruled over Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and Scotland, and it ruled over Greenland, Shetland, Orkney in Scotland, and small other areas in the British Isles. And the king had diplomatic relations with many countries, including Castile, that is Spain, and Scotland, and so on. Olaf IV reigned 1380 to 1387. He became king of Denmark and of Sweden. When he died, his mother Margaret took over, and Margaret passed the kingship on to a relative of hers who ruled over Pomerania in northern Poland, but his rule was not so strict, was not stabilized. Shortly afterwards, had the Black Death, 1349-1351. As a result of the Black Death of 1349-1351, the population of Norway was diminished. They include the population of the nobility. A lot less nobles were around, and the royal families. And following that, we had the Kalmar Union. The Kalmar Union, 1397-1523, it united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were one country, or one unified country, but with separate monarchs. On the whole, Denmark was dominant, and sometimes Sweden. Norway was usually a minor partner to either to Denmark or to Sweden. And under the Common Union, Norway suffered. It lost its overseas possessions. A lot of its nobles started to live outside the country. So did its kings often live outside the country. It was neglected. In 1523, the Common Union broke up when Gustav Vasa made himself king of Sweden and independent of the Union. Meanwhile, Denmark and Norway were ruled by the same monarch. Denmark and Norway had the same monarch after that, the same king, but he was independently a king of both of them. The countries were not unified, but he ruled over both of them, and with their parallel systems of government. And then there came the Protestant Revolution, the Protestant Reformation in Scandinavia, and the Norwegians were not happy with it. They resisted it. They wanted to remain Catholic, but the Danes more or less forced them to go ahead with it. And they also imposed their own bishops, their own clergy, their own clerical hierarchy over both Norway and Denmark. And that more or less brought the Norwegians into line. And so this was just a situation. The hereditary situation of the monarch, when the king would die, he would have to be replaced by someone who was eligible to be both the king of Norway and of Denmark. And therefore, not every potential heir or a successor was suitable for that. The potential heirs to the throne of Norway were found to be found not only in Denmark but also in Sweden and Schleswig-Holstein in northern Germany. Then there was independent province, and they too had a claim, would have a claim when the king of Denmark and Norway passed away. They too would have a claim to be kings of Norway, but not necessarily of Denmark as well. In 1661, Frederick III of Denmark and Norway, he introduced absolute rule on the monarchy. Then, more than 150 years later, after the Napoleonic Wars, Norway found itself joined to Sweden. The king of Sweden now was the king of Norway. And the royal house of Bernadotte then ruled over Sweden. Bernadotte was actually a French nobleman, possibly of Jewish descent, and we discussed this in our talk on Denmark, on Sweden. And he too, the rulers from the house of Bernadotte of Sweden, when they ruled over Norway, they tried to do as well as they could for their Norwegian subjects. They did not oppress them, and they took cognizance of their rights, and they tried to serve not only as Swedish monarchs but as Norwegian ones. But as the situation evolved, Norway was growing, it was developing economically. By 1905, Norway had become one of the world's leading shipping nations. Norway was important as a shipping nation, a nation with its own merchant marine, with its own fishing fleet. And they did not feel that the union with Sweden was not in their best interests, so they separated. So Norway was alone, and Norway was now looking for someone, a potential candidate to become king of Norway. So what the situation was that there were candidates. There were candidates in Sweden, candidates in Schleswig-Holstein, and also in Denmark. So the situation in Denmark, you had the king of Denmark, and then you had the heir to the throne, the heir apparent, the crown prince. That is the crown prince, and the father, king of Denmark, and his son, the crown prince. And you had two sons of the crown prince. There was the elder son of the crown prince, who would be a future king of Denmark, was expected to become a future king of Denmark. And there was a younger son, known as Prince Carl, and he was chosen to become the king of Norway. And why was he chosen? First of all, he had a claim on the throne through his family relationships. He was a legitimate candidate. Not only that, he already had a son. If they chose him, they wouldn't have problems about a successor when the time passed for him to die. There would be someone to replace him that would obviate a problem that had recurred in the past. And in addition to that, he was married to Princess Maud of Wales. That is, Princess Maud of Wales is the daughter of the British King Edward VII, 1901-1910. And by choosing Carl, who was married to the daughter of the King of England, to be their king, was hoped that they would receive support from Britain, or would facilitate their efforts to receive support from Britain. So he was chosen. He became the king of Norway. A few years later, he was the king of Norway. A few years later, his grandfather died, and his father became king of Denmark. And then later on, his father, king of Denmark, also passed away, and his son became king of Denmark. And this son who became king of Denmark became Christian X, whereas the king of Norway was known as Haakon VII. So Christian X and Haakon VII were brothers. The king of Norway and the king of Denmark were brothers. Christian X was the one we spoke about in our talk on Denmark, who would ride around the park in Copenhagen on his horse. He would meet occasionally Rabbi Benjamin Jacobson and say hello to him, have a little talk with him. And he was an important monarch, an important king in the history of the world history, and also in the history of Denmark. And his brother was King Haakon VII. Or he was actually King Prince Carl, and became King Haakon the Seventh. And he was the King of Norway, and this King of Norway was the brother of the King of Denmark. This brings us to the subject of Jews. Jews had been reported in Norway from the 1400s. From the 1400s, there were Jews in Norway, but in 1687, Christian V of Denmark and Norway, he expelled them all. And the same situation prevailed in Denmark as in Norway. And so initially some Sephardic Jewish were allowed to come, Jews of Sephardic origin from Spain and so on. And after that, other Jews came, also Jewish converts to Christianity were allowed to come. Some of them settled in Norway. In 1851, the Norwegian Parliament at the Stortinget lifted the ban against Jews, and they were awarded religious rights on a par with the Christian dissenters. The first Jewish community was established in Oslo. Oslo, the capital of Norway, in 1892. And the Jews were treated reasonably well in Norway. But there was prejudice against them. This prejudice included stereotypical depictions in the press and so on, also racial prejudice, conspiracy theories, like everywhere, conspiracy theories about the Jews also. They didn't allow Jewish ritual slaughter of animals. That is, they did not allow you to slaughter an animal without first stunning it. When you stun the animal, it cannot be slaughtered according to Jewish ritual requirements. So that in effect made Jewish ritual slaughter of animals forbidden. And they did this under the pretext of cruelty to animals. But in effect they allowed hunting. You could do what you want to wild pig, to wild animals. Do whatever you liked. It was considered hunting. Also whaling and sealing, bashing in the heads of seals and whales. I don't know what they were doing, throwing harpoons at them, tormenting them. All this was allowed. Only Jewish ritual slaughter was forbidden, and it has been forbidden in Norway until this day. In 1940, the Nazis invaded Norway. They invaded Norway at the same time as they invaded Denmark. In Denmark, there was no opposition to them because of the geographical situation. Denmark couldn't really, was not able to defend itself, so they allowed the Germans to come in, and they reached the mountains of Vivendi with the Nazis. The Nazis would interfere as little as possible in the internal affairs of the country, and they would supply Germany with agricultural produce and allow themselves to be ruled as quietly as possible. Whereas in Norway is different. Nazis invaded Norway, and they demanded the king appoint Viking Quisling as prime minister. A Norwegian renegade should be appointed as prime minister. That's where we get the name Quisling from. Quisling is someone who works for the other side, a traitor. And the king refused to appoint this person, Quisling, as prime minister. And the government, the Norwegian government, confirmed his refusal. And consequently, the government, the king, and his entourage and his government ministers went to Britain. Whereas Quisling made the country a one-party state. He recruited 6,000 Norwegians who went to fight alongside the Germans on the Russian side. A small percentage of the population supported Quisling. A great many more joined the Norwegian resistance movement. After the war, Quisling would be tried for treason. He would be found guilty and executed. Then this happened in 1940. In 1942, the Germans, with the support of the Norwegian police, the Norwegian police helped the Germans. They rounded up the Jews, began rounding up the Jews to deport them to concentration camps, especially Auschwitz-Birkenau. 800 Jews were deported, most of them were killed. The Norwegian church leaders protested very vigorously. And in fact, this is the thing about Scandinavia. The church leaders in Scandinavia were very strongly against Nazi, very strongly tried to protect the Jews on the whole, very, very strongly. The more religious you were in Scandinavia, the more pro-Jewish you were. In Germany, it was the opposite. In Germany, the Lutherans were mainly anti-Jewish. Whereas in Scandinavia, the Lutherans, the more religious Lutherans were pro-Jewish or protective of the Jews, or at least recognized the Jews as human beings did what they could to help them. Also, the Norwegian resistance did help the Jews. They rescued about 900 Jews, which is more than half of them. They got them to Sweden. Some of them even got to England. And they helped them. And many Norwegians helped the Jews escaped. Also, in addition to that, 5,000 non-Jewish Norwegians were also taken to concentration camps. 649 died there. And about 50,000 Norwegians escaped to Sweden. And the Norwegians did have a resistance to the invasion of the Germans. They resisted. They sank some German ships. They killed about 1,000 German soldiers. They enabled the royal family and Norwegian government to escape to Britain. The British and French troops attempted a landing at Narvik in Norway. They won a victory, but due to losses in France they were forced to evacuate. And the Norwegian army fought quite well alongside the Allies, until they too were forced to surrender. Many of them also managed to escape to Britain. And the Germans placed about 300,000 German soldiers were placed garrisoned in Norway. 300,000, that's the same number of Germans who were lost at the Battle of Stalingrad. The Germans had to place 300,000 soldiers in Norway. One German soldier for every 8 Norwegian citizens. And these soldiers were there to ensure the protection of Germany's supply of iron ore from Sweden, and also to protect naval and air bases which they hoped to strike at Britain, and to protect themselves from a possible invasion through Norway from Britain. And because the Norwegians were obviously pro-Allies, on the side of the Allies, and they couldn't be trusted, they needed a large number of soldiers in Norway on a permanent basis. And this, in effect, it was a contribution. They tied that number of soldiers up. They incapacitated them. They had to be there. The Germans had to keep them there to supply them, to feed them, to look after them, to take cognizance of their presence. And those 300 soldiers, 300,000 soldiers, were not able to be employed elsewhere. So this, in its own way, is a contribution to the war effort that the Norwegians provided, that Norway provided. On the other hand, about 15,000 Norwegians volunteered for combat duty on the Allied side. 6,000 of them have fought on the Eastern Front. But 40,000 Norwegians fought for the Allies. Also, the Norwegian Navy, Royal Norwegian Navy, fought on the side of Britain. They had evacuated many of their ships to Britain. They had their own air force on the British side. The Norwegian resistance also sabotaged the German war effort. They prevented the Germans from developing an atomic bomb, or helped prevent them. They helped prevent their heavy water projects, which were in preparation for an atom bomb. The Norwegians, together with the British, destroyed these preparations, the facilities for this preparation. And there still was a contribution. And the king of Norway, he was during World War II, he and his son, they apparently went in Britain. They were an important symbol of national unity, of resistance to the Nazi war effort. They were important also on the British side as for propaganda reasons. They also established relationships, contacts with the USA. This to help the Allies. They encouraged the fighting spirit of the Norwegian population, and they continued to be the legitimate government of Norway in Britain, defending the good name of Britain, defending the good name of Norway. After the war, at the end of the war, King Haakon and the Norwegian royal family, they returned to Norway. Together with the Crown Prince, Prince Olav. During the war, he had served as part of the Norwegian armed services, and he became quite an expert in military matters. And he contributed in his own way to the war effort. And he later became known for his expertise in NATO, and at some level, at an international level as well. He was considered the most knowledgeable of Norwegian military leaders, but this is an accomplishment. Crown Prince Olav eventually became King of Norway, and then he was followed by Harold V from 1991 to the present time. Harold V is a world champion in sailing. He's a world champion sailor. His wife is a Norwegian commoner, Queen Sonja, and he has an heir. His heir apparently his only son, Crown Prince Haakon. Crown Prince Haakon, they have 2 children, and Crown Prince Haakon, he likes windsurfing and surfing. This is an attribute of Naphtali. Speed and alacrity and related matters. So this also comes to expression in this case. At the end of the war, Norway took steps to rehabilitate the Jewish community. They tried to restore to the Jews properties that had been taken to them, but not in every case did this go into effect. So some Jews permanently lost their properties due to the Nazi occupation of Norway. So we have every now and again this a phenomenon that we found in Norway's relationships with the Jews, that on the whole they're decent, respectable towards them, even considerate, but every now and again there's a black cat, one could say, there's a black mark against them. Some little thing, some little unnecessary point of vindictiveness or malice even appears. So this, together with a lot of light, a lot of good things. So too in Scandinavia, the Scandinavian academics, including Norwegian ones. The University of Trondheim bought a book from me. They were interested in the subject. They considered it worth acquiring. They are open to the idea that their antecedents came from the Middle East. But also they recognise the archaeological and the historical grounds of justification for such beliefs. But to go all the way and to recognise themselves as being descendants of Israel, they're a little bit hesitant about that. Today there are about 1,500 Jewish people in the country. This has been declining. People are leaving. Most of them are in Oslo. There's also a synagogue in Trondheim as well as in Oslo. After World War II, Norway at first was ruled by socialist governments. And these socialist governments, like elsewhere in Europe, these new socialist governments were at first sympathetic towards the State of Israel. The State of Israel was comprised governed by Jews who suffered in the Holocaust, and sympathy for them because of this. Also, the early Israeli governments were socialist, left-wing. They felt an affinity for them. The Scandinavians also socialists and progressive. They fought an affinity, an ideological brotherhood, one could say, with the Israelis. But gradually this became more and more pro-Palestinian. A lot of pro-Palestinian propaganda in Norway. Sometimes it's vicious, sometimes it's malicious, mendacious. But that's the way it goes, and it's a reality all over the world. Also, the Norwegians attempted to make peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. This resulted in the Oslo Accords, which actually harmed Israel. Jews were killed because of this. Nevertheless, the intention had some positive aspects to it. The Norwegians genuinely felt that they were helping the Jews and the Arabs get together, and they were helping to set up peace in the Middle East, doing a good thing and hoping that this would also help the people, the Jews in Israel. So whether they were mistaken or not, that's another question. But to some degree, they had good intentions. So it was in the 1990s. This also brings us to another point concerning the tribe of Naphtali. The tribe of Naphtali, this is connected with the spies in the wilderness. When the Israelites came out of Egypt, they travelled through the wilderness. When they reached the edge of the borders of Canaan, Moses sent 12 spies, one spy from each of the tribes, to spy out the land. When the tribes went to the land, there were 40 days going through the land of Canaan. And they came back and they brought back a negative report about the land. All 10 of them brought back a negative report, apart from the Joshua and Caleb. Joshua from the tribe of Brit-Am and Caleb from the tribe of Judah. They brought back positive reports. But the other spies brought back negative reports, and they caused a demoralization amongst the peoples, and the peoples rebelled. They didn't want to go into the land. And because of that, the Almighty was angry with them, and he decreed that that generation, none of that generation would come into the land. They would all die in the wilderness. Only their children would come into the land. And the only ones of that generation who would be allowed to go into the land would be Joshua and Caleb. Joshua from Ephraim and Caleb from Judah. Now, according to rabbinical tradition, the tribe of Asher, Seth the son of Michael, and Nahbi son of Vopsi from the tribe of Naphtali, they were the prime instigators of the negative report. Like 10 of the spies had brought back a negative report, but out of the 10, 2 of them were the ringleaders, and these 2 ringleaders were from the tribes of Asher and the tribe of Naphtali, and both the tribes of Asher and of Naphtali have been predominant amongst the Norwegian people. And perhaps we saw this in the attitude of many in Norway to the state of Israel today. So this is worth keeping in mind and being conscious of it. Now there's a lot of immigrants from Muslim countries in Norway. And these Muslim immigrants, they harass Jews, they harass local Jews, they persecute them. They cause a lot of trouble, and the Norwegian authorities do little about it and even seem to be sympathetic towards them and apologetic for them. Because of that, many Jews are now leaving Norway. And according to surveys, about 30% of the population of Norway harbour anti-Jewish attitudes. So a good portion of that 30% are actually Muslims. But there's also a lot of Norwegians there. Native Norwegians are also against the Jews. So this still has to be faced up to. We should also remember that in Norway you have the old-time Nordic attitude of racialism. This existed long before the Nazis. You find this in old writings on race. Writings from British experts, Norwegian experts, German experts, and they say in effect that in very crude terms, they say that the most perfect human specimens are the Nordic people. And Nordic people is someone with a long head that is a long head, long as against compared to the breadth, tall, blonde, blue-eyed, fair, and with features typical of Scandinavian peoples. Now we know now that the head shape is an outcome of environment. This has been proven. This is also, you can see this in the state of Israel, you can see it elsewhere. It was known from the beginning. There were those who said as much. But now it is even more blatant, even more obvious and accepted than it used to be. But there's still some people who hold to the old ideas, or something of the whole old racial attitudes exists amongst the Norwegian populace, that they consider themselves to be supermen. One could say Nordic supermen, and or the equivalent. And not very many people, many of them hold these attitudes, but attitudes are there. Also, there are anti-Jewish sentiments among some of them. So we have to face up to this, have to realize this. This is a problem. In ancient times, the tribe of Naphtali was known for fishing. The tribe of Naphtali had its area by the lake of the Sea of Galilee. So-called Sea of Galilee is actually a freshwater lake, a very large freshwater lake. It supplies a major water supply for the whole of the state of Israel. In the past, it was much bigger than it is now, much bigger, much deeper, and it still has fish. There's fish. People still fish there, but in the past there was much more fishing than there is at present. And Naphtali was known for fishing. Naphtali was known for fishing, and Naphtali was allowed the other tribes also to fish there, in his area. And the area of Naphtali adjoined the Sea of Galilee and include the city of Tiberias. And we have the similar situation in Norway. In Norway, fishing has always been important. Norway fishes on the coast. There's always, and nearly always, been a plentiful supply of fish for the Norwegian population. This is one of the blessings given to Norway. And they combined fishing with farming on the coast, and then the tribe of Naphtali and Israel had done the same. Also, Norway petroleum is very important in the economy of Norway. Petroleum industry accounts for about a quarter of the country's gross domestic product. And on a per capita basis, Norway is the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas outside of the Middle East. Petroleum in Hebrew is neft, N-A-F-T, neft. Neft means petroleum in Hebrew. Neft is also the letters of the name Naphtali. Naphtali. The root of the name Naphtali is nefat, which is a word also meaning petroleum in Hebrew. So this is if Naphtali was destined to benefit from this blessing. Naphtali in biblical writings is the status of youth compared to the other tribes. Norway too has always had a similar position compared to its neighbours. Naphtali was compared to a female deer. A female deer, and the blessing of Jacob to his sons, because the commentators say because a female deer is much faster, much speedier than the male deer. And Naphtali was known for his speed and alacrity. But it was a female deer, and the Norwegians are big on feminine rights. The Norwegians give a lot of credence in women's rights and women's. They encourage women to work. They encourage women to lead, to dominate, and that is their thing. Also in the Bible, the prophetess Deborah. Deborah was a judge of Israel. She's the only female prophetess that we know of, apart from Yair, who wasn't really a prophetess, was an important person. So Deborah was a prophetess, and she was a female. She was a leader of Israel, and she was from the tribe of Naphtali. In Judges 4, it says, now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidot, was leading Israel at that time. She had caught on the palm of Deborah between Rabbah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. So she was also judged. She just adjudicated, she decided things. She also led or encouraged Barak ben Abinoam to lead volunteers from Naphtali and from Zebulun and to fight against the enemies of Israel, and he did so. And Zebulun actually gave rise to the people of the Netherlands. And the Netherlands and Norway have always been closely associated with each other. They have an interchange of populations, and traditionally they have cooperated in numerous ways. So we see this identification, this cooperation, even in the time of Judges with Deborah. Jacob blessed Naphtali, Genesis 49:21. Naphtali is a deer let loose, a doe, a female doe, a hind. He utters beautiful words. The royal national animal of Norway is a lion. But the national animal is a moose, an elk, which is a type of deer. And the symbol of Norway, or the blessing of Naphtali, was a female deer. But in symbolism, the males and the female equivalent can interchange. This is accepted. Traditional Scandinavian nobility, they frequently use the deer as a symbol. And so this too is something, it tells us something of importance. We also have the fjord horse, which is also important in Norway symbolism. The blessing to Naphtali said, Naphtali is a deer let loose. He utters beautiful words. This expression, beautiful words, Genesis 49:21, may also be translated to mean matters of improvement, indicating progress. Naphtali is known for intermedding with others, placating others, also being innovative, introducing improvements. The name Naphtali, very name Naphtali, connotes union, getting together. Naphtali means to twist things together like a wrestler, a combination, a union. This is one of the attributes of Naphtali. Naphtali seeks unification. He seeks to placate opposing sides. And This is an attribute of Naphtali. Also, according to rabbinical commentators, Naphtali may help initiate the final reconciliation between Judah and Joseph. Between Judah and Joseph may actually come from Naphtali. And Naphtali has this ability. In the case of the Jews and the Palestinians, it didn't work out so well. It backfired on them, but there was some degree of genuine concern. They did have good intentions to some degree, so this cannot be denied. The sacred stone of Naphtali, according to the Midrash and Bamidbar, because other accounts give other attributes, but according to this, the Aklama, the stone was the stone of Naphtali, and the pinkish type color. This too is feminine, which relates back to this attribute of femininity in Naphtali. And Naphtali, in the list of the tribes, is placed last. He didn't mind. This was an attribute of his. He didn't mind being the last. He did what he had to do. And he had achievements of his own. Rabbi Zadok HaKohen, a great rabbi, says that Naphtali binds the tribes together. He helps unify them. Naphtali gives supreme expression to the principle of unification. Also, the Abarbanel says Naphtali is a faithful emissary. Shimshon Raphael Hershel, Naphtali is distinguished by an inner harmony of character. There's something good about Naphtali. Something very beautiful inside and also outside. The Norwegians are handsome people. Naphtali was known for his speed, his alacrity, his gift of reconciling and peacemaking with other tribes, and his unification abilities. A correspondent of ours, Eric Tubokane, has pointed out that the god Thor probably originated in the ancient Armenia, the area of ancient Armenia. Ancient Armenia was one of the areas to which the lost 10 tribes were taken. Also, it adjoins Azerbaijan, and this too was one of the areas to which the 10 tribes were taken, according to rabbinical sources, and also archaeological findings, inscriptions, and so on. And we had Thor Heyerdahl, 1914-2002, of Kontiki fame, who later did a famous voyage across the oceans to prove connections between Pacific Islands and South America and so on. And the Thor Heyerdahl also did other famous trips. He proved that it was possible for ancient peoples to travel from Egypt to South America and so on. And he had a background in zoology, botany, geography, archaeology. And he also, in his later years, he made several visits to Azerbaijan. And he, on the basis of archaeological findings and writings and comparing carvings of ships and so on, he became convinced that from Azerbaijan in ancient times was a migration to Scandinavia. And this parallels the lost 10 tribes within that area at the time in question. So this also is proof the lost 10 tribes moved from the Middle East to Scandinavia. Not everyone agrees with Heyerdahl's claims, but he had something to base himself upon. He had proofs. He had evidence, and a lot of what he says, they cannot be easily dismissed. It is there. It is worth considering.